Let's be honest, airbrushing is not easy. The videos you see on YouTube make it look effortless. Splosh in some paint, pull the trigger, spray. Golden Demon. The reality is so far from this, it's no wonder that more than half of us have airbrushes sitting in the house gathering dust somewhere. Let's see if we can get you to polish it up and reintroduce it to your brushes. They've probably forgotten what each other look like. Welcome back to the State of Play. Now, I wasn't sure about making this video as I'm far from being an airbrushing expert. I muddle through, sometimes getting it right and thinking I've cracked it, only to do the exact same thing again and make a complete mess. Cleaning, variables, thinning paint, needles, nozzles, clogs, tip dry, pressure, compressors, spray booths, ventilation, space. Is it any wonder most of us just fall back on our brushes and rattle cans? They're infinitely easy and reliable by comparison. Shake and spray quickly and you're done. Or dip it in paint, slap it on a model, rinse with water, repeat. It's hard to go wrong. And you don't really need an airbrush anyway. Seriously, it's just another tool that you can 100% do without. But if you want one, or have one and don't use it, I figured there must be more people out there that have my same issues, so let's see if we can make the whole process a bit less frustrating. There's got to be a better way to approach this that makes it more enjoyable and less like a trip to the dentist. An airbrush has so many variables that getting any of them even slightly wrong means at best a mess, or at worst an hour-long strip down, intense clean and reassembly, just so you can try again. Now, as I said, I'm no expert with an airbrush by any means, but I figured the more variables I could turn into constants, the less I'd have to think and the more fun I'd have. Variables and constants. See, algebra isn't as useless as we all thought it was. Now, before all the comments flood in, this is a video for those who have or want an airbrush but just avoid it. Spare a quick thought for the rest of us who view an airbrush as an overly complicated, variable-ridden, time-sucking frustration of a tool. One, which we often have more satisfaction tidying away than we do setting up. So let's have a look at all those airbrush variables and see what we might be able to manipulate, ignore, or fix. Let's do this as a diagram because it's much easier to understand that way. Using an airbrush for wargaming models requires balancing these key components, even for the simpler tasks like priming and a quick zenithal. Pressure, needle and nozzle size, distance from model, and paint consistency. And fundamentally, to get the paint out, these are all controlled by one thing, your finger. And all of these things are dictated by the space you have available to do any of it. Get one of these wrong and you'll make a mess of your model. Get two of these wrong, you'll be taking your airbrush apart to clean it. 3 or 4 consistently wrong, well, at this point you have to consider the possibility that maybe an airbrush just isn't your optimal tool of choice. We should probably start with space, a place where you can actually do any of this. Without that, the whole endeavour is a non-starter. With acrylics, and I emphasise acrylics here, you don't need a huge warehouse-like ventilated space with a hazmat suit and a Geiger counter. You can fit everything into the same amount of space you use for brush painting. With lacquers or enamels or any more toxic paints, then proper ventilation is an absolute must. Ignore this warning at your own risk. The real world, unlike comic books, doesn't allow you to become a superhero when breathing, ingesting or falling into toxic materials. Sadly. I'm in no way saying acrylics are good for you, but you can get away with a mask, a cardboard box and an open window for short spray sessions. If you spray for longer periods for days on end, then I have to recommend a spray booth. Ideally one that will fold up and pack away so you can swap between tasks, which you may have seen in my 8 hobby tools video. But what about ventilation? Well, your first port of call is always to vent out of a window, but I know from Reddit or Instagram that some of you just can't do that. Maybe your hobby space has no window. Where you paint is some smaller space or some other reason that stops you from doing this. I looked into a few ways of solving this, mainly for cold days when I really didn't want to freeze by opening the window. I don't want to paint with my coat on. Spray booths are very good at capturing a lot of overspray with this sponge at the back. Anything else that gets through, which really is minimal, is sucked through the fan and out the back. You can capture any residual particles with a slightly damp sock. An unworn clean one, obviously. Just stretch it over the tube at the back of the booth. When you're finished painting, just wash the sock in warm soapy water and let it dry. You probably don't want to use this sock again as, an actual sock. Just let me reiterate, this is not a full substitute for venting outside, but if you have no other choice, this will work. And it's absolutely not going to work with more toxic paints. Those have fumes as well as particles. And I know some of you out there might be going, no, 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 full ventilation is a must. But realistically, walking down a street in heavy traffic puts more toxins in your lungs than spraying a few models in a box while wearing a mask. The second most questioned aspect of airbrushing is paint consistency, and that's usually the one that causes the most pain. You've heard the paint should have the look and feel of milk, right? Which milk? Organic, semi-skimmed, full fat? What about soya or coconut? I always found it such an arbitrary description that it ended up meaning nothing. I once even put milk in a little tray and mixed paint next to it. Unsurprisingly, thinned Mephiston red looks nothing like supermarket semi-skimmed farm assured milk. But it got me thinking, what if I don't want the paint to be like milk? What if I want it thicker or thinner? So the first variable I fixed was paint. I just decided to plan my paint the same way as I would for a brush. Thicker for base coats, thinner for layering, even thinner for glazes. I figured the first thin coat of 2 thin coats would go through an airbrush. Obviously it still needs to be fluid enough to spray though, and this is where the entire process gets confusing. Do you thin your paint for spraying, or do you make it flow better? Thinner, multiple manufacturers. Flow improver, multiple brands. Water, tap, distilled, Evian. So, which is it? Here's how I understood it, and right or wrong, this worked. Thinner. Makes your paint more transparent, but contains alcohol so it'll dry quicker. Which is great on your model, but causes tip dry and potential clogs in your airbrush. Water. It's pretty much the same as thinner, except it's more dependent on the room temperature where you're spraying and is kind of halfway between the other two, and is affected by hard or soft water in your area. I just avoid water as I could never get it to work right. Flow improver. This improves the fluidity by breaking the surface tension of the paint, but it dries slower. Slower on your model, but it's great against tip dry and clogging. So if you want your paint more transparent, use thinner. If you want it to flow, use flow aid. If you want both, add both. However, I moved to golden airbrush medium, which I found eliminated all that faffing around with ratios of thinner versus water versus flow aid, which I'd struggled with so badly. I swore at my airbrush more often than I did at episodes of Game of Thrones Season 8. Contrast, speed, paint, inks, Molotov, washes, all just spray incredibly easily, but for all of the thicker paints, I now just 50-50 with this for normal spraying and add more if I want it more transparent. And I just don't worry about milk anymore. But in order to not worry about any kind of slightly thicker consistency, that's where the second variable you can fix comes in. Pressure. I got over my obsession with 25 psi and just whacked it up to 30 to 35, and I'll leave it there. It never changes. People who spray with fabric medium onto clothing will know how thick that stuff is. And you can't dilute it or it won't adhere to the material, so the pressure is usually somewhere in the 50s and 60s. If they can do it spraying effectively yogurt, then I'm sure we can do it with some slightly runny Thousand Suns blue. At 30 to 35 you can pretty much spray anything through. With enough pressure, anything large will go through a small hole. Just ask any woman with children. But this is way too much for thinner paints like contrast or speed paints, and no good for close-up work. This is where an inline or airbrush pressure valve really transforms your spraying. I picked up this FPC valve, meaning fine pressure control, for my Harder and Steenbeck airbrushes, and this Sparmax inline hose valve for my Sparmax Flyer. Some airbrushes are lucky enough to have these already built in, and they allow you to easily turn it up or down whilst spraying to get it just right, and all reaching back to the compressor. These usually go from 20% pressure to 100%. Now I can pour in whatever paint consistency I want, start a test spray and turn the valve until it sprays how I want. The third thing you can fix is needle size. This is probably the easiest of the hardware issues to fix because, well, you simply buy one needle and use that for everything. Your airbrush probably came with one anyway. The vast majority of us airbrush noobs can get away with the 0.4mm needle for almost all jobs. Once you get more proficient, you can start experimenting with other smaller sizes, but 0.4 is a great workhorse size. Okay, now let's go back to our original variables and see where we are. Pressure, now fixed and easily changed with a valve on or near the airbrush. Needle and nozzle size now fixed to 0.4mm. And paint consistency is now based on the job we want to do, thin 50-50 with golden airbrush medium. So we're left with distance from model and your finger. These are the two that I can't fix for you, but consider that if all the other variables are fixed, this is now the only thing you need to work on, and it simplifies the whole irritating process. These two variables are totally dependent on what you want to achieve and how much control you have over your own dexterity. On a dual action airbrush, how hard you press the trigger and how far you pull back determines how much paint comes out. You know that. And it's not like anyone ever bothered over 100 years to redesign these things to be more ergonomic. They're awkward to hold, all the parts just feel like they're in the wrong place for a human hand, and it's far too easy to get it wrong. So it's always best to learn how to do it the hard way. We can make this even easier. Many airbrushes now come with a limiter on the end or allow you to buy one as an attachment. These are the airbrush equivalent of stabilizers on a kid's bicycle and help with both the distance from model issue and your lack of experienced fine finger control. You basically just use this knob and click mechanism to limit how far back you can pull the trigger, which then limits the amount of paint sprayed out and the mess you could make. This thing has saved me from flooding the model so many times. It's always better to have less paint come out and do multiple coats than ruin it in one big splat. Turn it and click it in to lock. Test the pullback distance and repeat until you've got the balance of paint spray right. Click it again to unlock, just like a ballpoint pen. I always keep two pieces of card in my spray booth, one black, one white, for testing lighter and darker colours for coverage before going anywhere near a model. In fact, I also keep a primed model here too for a backup test. Now, as I said, with most of these airbrush variables fixed and the only thing you need to work on being your finger, the whole daunting process should be a bit more enjoyable. Once you've got the hang of all of this, then you can start experimenting with each variable one by one until you find your sweet spot. But let's end this video with a few things that were my major factor in avoiding the airbrush. Quick colour changes and cleaning. Yeah, I got so obsessed with cleaning that I'd strip and clean the airbrush between every colour. I'd be spending more time cleaning than actually painting a model, and I just had enough. So I decided to spend several hours for one day doing nothing but changing colours to see which way I could do it the quickest. I made up a load of cheap white and black paint and just kept swapping between the two to figure out what was the most efficient. Turns out that all that was required was water in a squeezy bottle and a large pot. And yeah, Ninjon showed this exact thing in his Leviathan painting video, but I'd already outlined this one before he released that, so yeah, thanks mate. Basically just angle your airbrush cup over the pot and just squeeze water into it until the cup is rinsed. Then fill it back up with water and spray it all out at full pressure. I use one of these, but you could just spray it into an old towel. It's really not that much water. Repeat until no more colour comes out. That's it. You can get this entire process down to 45 seconds with practice. Now you can put in your next colour and continue spraying until it's time for a full cleanup. I can't help much with the full cleaning aspect in this video as that's a job in itself. Sadly, until they invent a self-cleaning airbrush, that part is always going to be a pain. But to cut a long story short, I take it apart, dump all the bits in a 50-50 alcohol and water mix, leave it for a bit, then clean it with a bunch of interdental brushes or some cheap airbrush cleaning brushes. If, like me, you just left your airbrush on a shelf and kept reaching for a brush instead, then hopefully this video has given you a bit of a push to pick it up more often. Now, I want you to do one thing. Set aside a few hours, take a model, maybe one you don't care about, and I want you to paint the entire model using only your airbrush. Everything. Don't even look at a brush. And yes, it'll probably be terrible. Likely the worst thing you've ever done. But that's not the point. The goal is to get comfortable doing it and laugh at yourself while you're doing it. Believe me, once you've been through this ordeal, and yes, it will be an irritating, terrifying, hilarious ordeal, everything you do after this will seem simple in comparison. And that's the state of play for today. Happy spraying. I'll catch you next time.